Well, hi, thanks for joining me today. I am Eric Bjornstad with Bell Performance. I'm Technical Information Director for Bell here in Longwood, Florida. And what are we going to talk about today? Well, we want to talk about diesel fuel treatments. We want to do an overview of the topic of diesel fuel treatments. And uh, by the time we're finished today, we're aiming to do a couple of things here. By the time we're finished today, we want you to be a lot more familiar than you are now with a number of key types of information on this topic. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, whenever you're talking about diesel fuel treatments, what you're really talking about is several things. You're talking about what problems do these diesel fuel users have that can be attributed or directly related to that diesel fuel that they use. That's number one. Number two is you're going to have to consider what opportunities do we have as Bell Performance to solve those problems and bring those consumers value through some kind of diesel fuel treatment. In other words, if you identify the problems, then what can you do about those problems from a chemical treatment level? And as we discuss the multifunction treatments on the diesel side that Bell Performance offers, then we're going to talk about what these do. We're going to talk a little bit about how they do what they do, how they work, basically, and definitely want to touch on what value points, what value propositions will the end user see when they're using those kind of diesel fuel additives. So that's what we're going to aim to cover today. So with all that in mind, well, let's go ahead and jump in. Let's talk about, again, this is what we're going to cover: fuel-related problems and concerns, the markets for diesel additives. In other words, when we say markets for diesel additives, what we mean is not everybody out there in the marketplace has the same kind of problems. So if you're looking at a fleet versus a generator user versus something else, are there different, do each of these three different markets see different kinds of problems and therefore have different kinds of opportunities to help? And then, of course, the Bell Performance Multifunction Diesel Solutions. Okay, so when you survey the diesel landscape, the landscape of diesel fuel use, you start asking questions about what issues do diesel users face, you get these kind of things, right? Diesel fuel users are always, just like gas users, just like anybody, they're always concerned with mileage. They want to get more mileage out of every gallon of diesel that they use. Now, this is not so much a problem necessarily as a want. When somebody said, well, my problem is my mileage, well, in order for something to be identified as a problem, that means that it is essentially what you're saying when you say, I have a problem with something. You're saying that it is below a certain standard. If you don't know what your standard is, how can you know if it's a problem? So, for most people, when they're conceptualizing this mileage thing, it's a want. They want to get the most out of their fuel as possible, and that's definitely not an unreasonable goal to aim for. You see the second point, emissions and DPF service intervals. Now, individual users may not necessarily be so concerned about their vehicle emissions, but when you start to get to agencies and municipalities and B2B users, business users, well, they definitely are, especially when you consider that emissions correlate with DPF intervals. Diesel particulate filters, they trap the partially burned carbon and they have to be regenerated. So if you're not burning fuel as efficiently as you should, you're going to have to do regens more often, and it's entirely possible that your DPF, your filter, your filter medium may not last as long as it should, and that is a problem. Widespread ingress of biodiesel into on-road diesel fuel is a concern, especially for the many people who store diesel fuel, because biodiesel has some major concerns, as do today's ULSD fuels. You see that third thing says instability. The fourth thing says microbes. Well, those can be related in today's ULSD fuels because they've done things to the fuel to try and make them more environmentally friendly, and it has fundamentally altered how that fuel plays out in the marketplace, and so they don't have as long storage life, and it's a lot more susceptible to microbial activity. So those are big problems. Now, we mentioned, recent changes in fuel. Let's look into that a little bit more depth here. Diesel fuel has undergone substantial changes in the last decade or so, which has led to major issues for its users. Now, the first thing you have to consider when you talk about this subject is the cracking issue. Cracked fuels. You increased use of cracked feedstocks is a major contributor to some of these problems. When we say cracking, you say, well, what are we talking about here? And without going into tremendous amount of depth, basically, cracking is a process that's used at the refinery level, where they take when they are refining crude oil and they're taking out the various or producing the various kinds of fuel and kinds of products that they normally get out of that crude. They get natural gas, they get gasoline, they get kerosene, they get number 2 diesel, number 4, number 6, and then they have the residual left over. Cracking is the process that enables them to take the heavier parts and basically break them apart and get more of the gasoline and the on-road diesel fuel out of it than they used to be able to. So they're able to increase their yields of that by substantial amounts compared to decades past. But the cracked fuels, we call those cracked fuels now because they're made with cracked feedstocks. Chemically, they're not exactly the same. Their molecules have more double bonds in them. Double bonds are more reactive, so they don't last as long in storage. They're more susceptible to undergoing chemical changes that cause them to be dark, cause them to form sludge, all that kind of stuff. So cracking is a primary contributor to the decrease in the stability of diesel fuel. It used to be that you could get, if you were able to control the water, it used to be that you could get 2 to 5 years. Say that again, between 2 and 5 years of good solid storage of diesel fuel. Now you're lucky to get a year out of it. Now you see that second point, removal of sulfur from diesel. That's the other big one. It's been done as a response to a legislative mandate. The Congress, through the Clean Air Act, says we need to improve air quality, and one of the things that they mandate is they're going to take the sulfur out of diesel fuel. So we have ultra low sulfur diesel, commonly known as ULSD, and ultra low sulfur diesel. It's a lot better for the environment. Compare ULSD now in 2016 to ULSD from, let's say, the year 2000, it is not a stretch to say that today's diesel fuel, combined with the engine advances, means that diesel trucks are 99.7% cleaner than they were 15 years ago. It's not a stretch or an exaggeration at all to say that. And so that's a good thing. But it comes with a few downsides. On the fuel side, your downside is you have lubricity problems, you have cold flow issues. It does not respond as well in the cold. It gels up easier in the cold than it used to. And the big one is the point number 3, susceptibility to microbes. Diesel fuel used to rely on its sulfur content in order to ward off microbial activity, because microbes don't really like sulfur. So we would say that sulfur is a natural biocide. Well, you take all the sulfur out, now there's nothing in that ultra low sulfur diesel left to prevent the microbes from growing. So today's ULSD fuels have a significantly shorter storage life, not only because of the cracked feedstocks, but because it's much more common for them to have microbes growing in them. And then this last one, the biodiesel, the renewable fuel standard, Not only has it given us ethanol on the gasoline side, but it's given us biodiesel use on the diesel side. Most diesel fuels today have up to 5% biodiesel content mixed into them, and they don't have to change any of the labeling. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't need to worry about biodiesel because I don't use it, well, you are a lot more wrong than you may think. You are using biodiesel. You just nobody's told you that you are, because they're blending in 2, 3, 4, 5% into that diesel fuel that you thought beforehand was just your conventional 100% diesel. Why is biodiesel a problem? Well, biodiesel is less stable. It's more susceptible to microbes. Microbes love this stuff. And it attracts water. That's a bad trifecta. Stability, microbes, and water. Very bad combination. Okay, so those are the fundamental changes from the last few years. What do these fundamental changes, what have these led to in the fuel itself, in the field itself? What are users seeing? Well, they're getting deposits in their diesel engines. The poor combustion of the diesel fuel, because it's not as stable, because it's made with more cracked feedstocks, you're getting greater incidences of poor combustion, leading to higher incidences of engine and injector deposits, and it affects the emissions levels. Now, one thing to note here is that unlike gasoline, one big difference between diesel and gasoline is this: there are no legal injector detergent requirements for diesel fuel. There are for gasoline. Most gasoline comes from the refinery with injector detergents, some amount of injector detergents already present. Not so for diesel engines, so you get diesel injector deposits a lot more easily, and injector deposits are probably, apart from driver behavior, injector deposits are the single biggest influencer to engine performance and mileage of pretty much anything. So if you can keep the injectors clean, you can keep your mileage up to its optimal level. This last thing, they're seeing more water in stored diesel because of the biodiesel issue. And this is a problem because microbes like it. Microbes need free water in storage tanks in order to grow. And diesel injectors, especially the common rail diesel injectors that are, the common rail systems that are pretty much becoming the standard among new trucks, they have very, very little tolerance for water because water has the potential to destroy a diesel injector. Some other things. Microbes and stability. Lubricity with ultra low sulfur diesel. In 2006, 2007 up to about, let's say, 2010, 11, there were big lubricity problems because when you remove sulfur from diesel fuel, you strip out a lot of the lubricity, and the injectors and the fuel pumps relied on lubricating properties of diesel fuel in order to keep from wearing out. Now, one thing we should say is we should touch on this point. Because we just said that most diesel fuel today has low-level bio in it, one of the good things about that is that even as little as 2% biodiesel content will actually solve this lubricity problem. So that's kind of an unintended good consequence that's come out of the intersection of the whole biofuels issue with the ultra-low sulfur diesel issue. Okay, cetane. Cetane, inadequate cetane rating, is one of the most noticeable problems that you could have with a vehicle. The reason why this is a problem is because there are a lot of storage tanks that have seen their stored fuels lose cetane rating over time. If your cetane rating is not high enough, it will affect the engine's performance. The fuel won't burn as cleanly, so you get higher emissions. If it's a generator or a backup generation, like so let's say in a backup emergency generation system, it's not going to start very well. And if the cetane rating has dropped enough, you may not be able to get proper running when you get it up to 50% load or 75% load. Many times it won't run properly. Um, so, all of these things, lubricity, cetane, emissions, microbes, stability problems, excessive water, all of these things are areas that as people who treat fuel, as people who formulate chemical solutions for fuel problems, these are the areas that we are going to be attacking, so to speak. Our goal here with respect to these is to help our customers reduce their operational costs and extend the life of their equipment. We're aiming to provide solutions that put value back in their pockets by reducing those costs and extending their equipment life, things like that. And so given these goals, and given all of these self-evident problems we've just been describing, Bell Performance offers as its primary solution, we offer Dee-Zol, which is our multifunction fuel treatment. And the primary thing that we would look at when we were trying to determine what was right for a given customer. So let's look a little bit closer at the Dee-Zol multifunction. Now, Dee-Zol was not the first fuel additive that Robert Bell formulated. Robert Bell was the company's founder. He actually developed his first fuel additive in 1909, which was basically just a detergent package for gasoline. He then developed a surfactant technology that enabled water to be suspended into petroleum, which normally is not something you're able to do. He did that in 1927, which led to the gasoline multifunction mix-ago. Fast forward to 1954, he started to delve into the diesel side. He's already developed a heavy fuel oil, a heavy diesel fuel oil treatment that he called ATX 909. Well, now he's recognized, well, we need to do something for the on-road vehicles. And that's when he came up with Dee-Zol. 1954 is when he formulated it. Now, its formula, of course, has not stayed the same. It has evolved over the years, but its goal still remains the same. To effectively to address all of the major problems that diesel fuel users use. We say major problems, all the major ones that people are most concerned with. So the types of things that it has in its formulation, you can see on the screen, it has combustion improver. It has a detergent. Again, remember we said that keeping injectors clean is the number one thing you can do to positively affect mileage and performance. Very important. It has a dedicated cetane improver, 2-ethylhexyl nitrate. It has enough cetane improver in it that it will, when used at its normal treat rate, it will increase the fuel cetane rating by about 1.5 to 2 points, which is a good little bump. Also has lubricity improver in it, has stabilizer and dispersant package, has a water control package. This one right here, cold flow, we have a cold weather version of Dee-Zol called Dee-Zol Plus. And the only difference between Dee-Zol Plus and regular Dee-Zol here is that Dee-Zol Plus has some amount of cold flow in it, or cold flow improvement polymer in it to lower the gelling temperature of the fuel by X number of degrees. So you get all 6 or 7 of those benefits in a concentrated formula with a treat rate 1 to 1280. In layman's terms, that means 1 ounce treats 10 gallons of diesel fuel. So let's just talk a little bit about each one of those. The first one we listed was combustion improver. We always list that first because, like we said earlier, mileage is the thing that people always cite first. Hey, what do you want? Well, I want better mileage. So, combustion improver. Dee-Zol contains an organic combustion improver. Now, we say organic combustion improver because there are organometallic combustion improvers out there. In fact, Bell Performance's Atomics products, that's what they contain. They contain organometallic combustion catalysts. The problem is that you can't put such a thing in on-road fuel. Otherwise, it would have those. So, as an alternative, it has an organic combustion improver, a non-metallic one. Now, how does it work? Well, it does a couple of things. Um, probably the biggest thing that it does is that it prevents, as you can see on the screen, it prevents pre-oxidation reactions in the combustion chamber. And to make a long story short, basically, when fuel is injected into a combustion chamber, it mixes with the air, and part of that fuel will start to oxidize immediately before the fuel explodes and combusts from the heat of combustion inside that engine. And the portion of the fuel that underwent these, what I call pre-oxidation reactions, well, it's not going to burn nearly as fully, nearly as well as all the rest of the fuel. So the combustion improver actually minimizes that from happening, and so it allows the maximum amount of fuel to burn, most fully, basically. The second thing it does is that because of its molecular weight and because of its heat of combustion, it increases the heat of combustion of the overall fuel mixture. But that part is really more of a secondary aspect of what the combustion improver does. Okay, second thing, detergency. Again, keeping injectors clean, very, very important. Engine technology today is a far, far cry from how it was 20 years ago, or even 10, 15 years ago. Now we have these common rail diesel engines. Um, a common rail diesel engine is pretty much the standard now. And basically, what it is it's an engine setup where all of the injectors are lined up and are attached to a central rail that runs along the top of the cylinders. And what it's able to do is it's better able to control how and when the fuel is injected into the cylinders, and it's also able to generate higher amounts of pressure, which enables that engine system to do all sorts of things that it was not able to do before, like have 3 or 4 or even 5 injection events in a single piston stroke, which is something that previous engine designs just simply could not do. The overall benefit is that you get a more efficient engine, fewer emissions. It's just a more robust, more advanced engine design. As such, the injectors that go along with that kind of engine, well, they're more advanced than they used to be. They have higher pressures, up to 2,000 bars. They're a lot less tolerant to things like particulates and deposits and things like that. And so it's even more important now to have a good detergent in that diesel fuel to keep those diesel fuel injectors clean. And so the detergent that Dee-Zol has is an excellent detergent package, one of the best on the market, because that's what you need in this kind of situation. Now, when you provide enough detergency in diesel fuel, what do you get? Well, you prevent formation of deposits. And when you prevent the formation of deposits, that keeps the fuel pattern at an optimal, and at an, I don't want to say optimal level, but it keeps the fuel spray the way that it should. And if the fuel spray is the way that it should, that means you're going to get closer to the best combustion that you can out of that injector. You also get a good detergent will reduce wear in the upper cylinder. It will prevent ring deposits. And all of these things lead to better fuel economy. Documented from engine tests, you can get up to 3.5% better fuel economy if you have clean injectors versus dirty injectors. And 3.5% is not insignificant. You can get your horsepower and your torque back. You'll have less combustion noise. You'll reduce your emissions and black smoke significantly. You'll make your injectors last longer. That's a benefit. And you get overall, you will get a cleaner, a cleaner fuel system. So all of these benefits together are significant enough benefits that any diesel user should actively seek out a diesel fuel treatment that has a good detergent package in it. So the third thing, I think it's the third thing, cetane improver. As we said, there's enough cetane improver in the Dee-Zol formulation that when used at 1 to 1280 treat rate, it will add up to 2 points of additional cetane. Now, if your fuel has inadequate cetane rating, what does that do? Well, it causes the combustion of the fuel to be out of sync with how the engine was designed. An engine is a finely tuned machine that has a lot of moving parts, all engineered to work to do certain things at certain times relative to when other parts of the engine are doing certain things at their certain times. And if your fuel cetane is of inadequate level, then the fuel combustion is not going to happen at the right time relative to where the cylinder is, and that means that you're going to get more unburned fuel. You're going to get the engine's going to be noisier. You're going to get more black smoke, more emissions. You're not going to get as much mileage. All of that kind of stuff. So if you can raise the fuel cetane rating up closer to what the engine actually needs, you will help solve all of those problems. Better mileage, lower emissions, a smoother running engine that has more power, all of that kind of stuff. Lubricity, like we said earlier, the ULSD changes took a lot of the lubricity out of the diesel fuel, and Dee-Zol really helped by having this fuel-soluble lubricant. It would improve the lubricity rating of the diesel fuel, which meant it helped lubricate injectors, the fuel pumps, and it also provided ring lubrication in the upper cylinder area. Nowadays, because of the biodiesel blending that we mentioned, this particular benefit is not quite so important, but we still leave the top cylinder lubricant. That's what we call it. We leave the top cylinder lubricant in the Dee-Zol formulation because it still provides some benefit, especially in the top cylinder area with the rings. So there was not really a good reason for us to take it out. Stabilizer and dispersants. If you've listened to any of our other trainings, you know that diesel fuels are less stable than they used to be, and they really require a good stabilization package in order to maximize or extend their storage life. Now, there are plenty of fuel stabilizers out there, but they're not all equal. Some are a lot better than others. Well, that should beg the question, what makes one good versus not so good? Well, a good stabilization package should contain 5 things. We're listing 3 things here. Number 1, it should contain an antioxidant to prevent those oxidative chain reaction initiation, basically exposure to air. Anything that donates oxygen, that's oxidation, and that's the primary chemical reaction driver of sludge formation. So antioxidant will prevent these chain reactions from initiating, which basically means they don't get started at all. A good stabilization package will also have a dispersant to keep sediment particles apart and keep your fuel from looking like this guy's fuel right here with all that in the bottom. Should contain antiperoxidals because peroxide formation is another major pathway to fuel instability. So it contains antiperoxidals to keep those peroxides from forming. It also contains metal deactivators because there are certain kinds of metals that when the fuel comes into physical contact with them, they catalyze reactions that break the fuel apart. Well, the metal deactivator will actually tie up those metals and keep that that catalytic effect from manifesting. And then the 5th one I cannot actually remember what the fifth one is. So you've got antioxidants, dispersants, antiperoxidals, metal deactivators, and then there's a fifth one as well. But so when you put all of those together, what you get is a stability package that improves and extends the storage life of diesel fuel, gives you a longer storage life. And for people who store diesel for any amount of time, this is something that's really essential to have nowadays with today's ultra-low sulfur diesel fuels. Water control. Water control, again, very important to have because ULSD is a lot more susceptible. Well, first of all, ULSD attracts water just in and of itself. It is more what the term that they use is hygroscopic. ULSD is more hygroscopic than diesel fuels of the past. And when you attract water like that, and when you get a development of or a buildup of free water in your tank, you get microbes that go along with it. So the water controller in Dee-Zol will pick up free water and it will suspend it up into the fuel. It's no longer free water, it's now suspended water. It suspends it in very small, micron-sized packets, which are small enough that they can pass through injectors, which means they don't damage injectors, and then they just go out into the combustion chamber and they turn into steam. So the water controller in Dee-Zol helps protect the injectors. It helps reduce microbial growth, not by killing microbes, but by changing the conditions such that it becomes less favorable for microbes to grow. Microbes already in that fuel, then Dee-Zol is not going to kill those or get rid of those. If you've already got microbes in that fuel, you need something else besides Dee-Zol. But luckily, Bell Performance has such a thing. It's the biocide antimicrobial biocide treatment. So that's basically those are the main product benefits: combustion improver, stability, water control, detergency, cetane improver, lubricity improver. You get all 6 of those essential benefits in one multifunction package in Dee-Zol. How much of it do you need to use? Well, we mentioned earlier, it has a concentrated treat rate of 1 to 1280, which is equivalent to 1 ounce treating 10 gallons of fuel. Now, when you're comparing Dee-Zol to any number of other things, one of the things you really need to look at is what treat rate you need to use of a given additive, because the treat rate is what determines whether an additive can do whatever it's claiming to do. You could have an additive, and there are plenty of them out there that claim to do 5, 6, 7 different things. Dee-Zol claims to do 6 different things. So it's one thing to claim those, but if you're going to claim that it has an effect in a fuel, then you need to be able to deliver into that fuel. You need to be able to put enough of a specific kind of active ingredient such that it will actually do that. For example, a cetane improver. If Dee-Zol contains cetane improver, you add Dee-Zol at the recommended rate, it will raise the fuel's cetane number by 1 to 2 points. It will do that, and it can only do that because it contains enough cetane improver, enough 2-ethyl hexyl nitrate in the Dee-Zol formulation that when you put it into the fuel at 1 to 1280, then the concentration of 2-EHN, cetane improver, is enough in the fuel that that the cetane number is impacted. So treat rate is what determines whether an additive can actually do what it claims to do. Now, the reason why we stress this is because there are plenty of additives out there. Cal 5 is one that comes to mind. Has a treat rate of 1 ounce to 39 gallons. There's another one out there that does 1 ounce to 80 gallons. Now, it's fine if it's a certain kind of thing where you don't need very much, like a metal deactivator. excuse me, you only need, a metal deactivator in and of itself, you might only need 6 or 7 parts per million of that kind of thing for it to do that one thing. The problem, though, is that these additives are claiming to do, 6, 7, 10 different things at these outrageously low treat rates. They claim, 1 to 10,000 because that, that makes consumers' ears perk up. They say, oh, I don't need to use very much. It's cheap for me to do that. But unfortunately, the reality is that at such a low treat rate, it's really impossible for it to do what it's claiming to do because you don't have enough of it in there. What kind of things? How much do you need of different kinds of things? Well, for a detergent, you might only need 100 parts per million of detergent, unless you're talking about something that cleans really dirty injectors in one tank, in which case you'd need more. So 100 parts per million, if you translate that to a different expression, that's 1 to 10,000. So if an additive is only a detergent package, then sure, it could clean effectively at 1 to 10,000, but the same additive could not also do 9 additional things at 1 to 10,000 because its entire formula space is being used up with that one detergent. Cetane improvers typically need 5 or 6 or 700 parts per million for them to work. So the bottom line here is that when you're selecting or when your customers, whether you're the end user or whether you're someone working for Bell that's talking to people out in the field, when they are selecting a fuel additive, trying to make the best decision, treat rate relative to product claims is definitely one of the things that they need to look at. And if the two don't match up, then they probably need to steer clear of it because they're just throwing money down the drain. And it's situations like that that really give the fuel additive business, the fuel additive industry, a bad name. Companies formulating these snake oil products that claim to do everything under the sun at 1 drop per tank. That's not good. All right, as we start to wrap up here, just a couple more things that we want to talk about. The first thing is, what are the opportunities present for people to use Dee-Zol? Who would use Dee-Zol? Who are the ideal kinds of people for which a diesel multifunction like Dee-Zol would be most appropriate? Well, it would be these kind of people. Anybody who uses diesel fuel. That's a whole bunch of different kinds of people, basically, public and private sector fleets, buses, construction equipment, light marine, light diesel marine. And what we mean by that is not the huge ships that burn heavy fuel. We have different treatments for those. So we're talking about the light to medium size diesel powered ships, like, for example, a tugboat, something like that. And of course, regular use diesel generators. All of those kinds of market sectors would definitely be appropriate users for Dee-Zol, and all of them would get substantial benefit out of what Dee-Zol has to offer. And finally, what we're going to do, we're going to wrap up with a brief discussion of this issue of registration of fuel additives. Now, this is the reason why we end with this is because this is important. This is important to know, and it's important to be able to communicate effectively to the people that you're going to be talking to. Now, it's well established that there's 1,000 different fuel additive formulations, and besides the fact of considering is it going to do what it claims, another thing to consider is it going to be safe for my engine? And this is where the issue of registration of fuel additives comes in. To make a long story short, anytime you want to sell a fuel additive for an on-road application, then you need to have that fuel additives formulation submitted to the EPA. The EPA looks over what you've got in it, and then they will either approve it or they will disapprove it. Well, what determines if they approve it? What they're looking for is this. They're looking for if the stuff that you've got in that formulation is substantially chemically similar to what's already in fuel. Now, why does this matter? What significance does substantially chemically similar have? Well, the EPA's reasoning is fuel is made up of certain types of elemental things. It's made up of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. It's got some nitrogen in it. It's got smaller amounts of other things. Like it can have some sulfur in it, of course. It might have a little bit of phosphorus in it. Not much, but maybe a little bit. There's a couple other things, but by and large, those are the things that fuel's made out of. Now, if you have a fuel additive that contains only those kind of things, then pretty much it's not really going to be any reasonable chance that that's going to adversely affect the engine in some catastrophic way, because you're only putting more of what's already in the fuel into that engine. And so that is the EPA's way of kind of helping the consumer, kind of ensuring that they don't have crazy formulations out there that have all sorts of weird and wild things in it, that when you put those in an engine, the engine blows up. Because we don't want that. It's bad for trade. It's bad for the marketplace. So all on-road fuel additives are required to be registered with the EPA, and the EPA will approve or disapprove, and they'll be looking based on the kinds of things that you have listed in that formulation and the treat rate that you suggest as well. So if the stuff that you have in it only contains carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, those kind of things, you're probably going to be good to go. But if you've got Joe Bob's tank elixir that has iron filings in it, well, iron is not typically found in fuel, and the EPA is going to kick it back to him and say, no, you can't sell this. So the important thing here is that any legitimate on-road fuel additive is going to be registered with the EPA, and you can easily find all of those just by going to Google and Googling something like diesel fuel additive registration. That'll take you to the EPA's website, and they have a list of all the registered, both for gasoline and diesel, all the registered fuel additives and the companies that hold their registrations. So that's public information, pretty easy to find there. So I think that pretty much covers all of the major bases that we needed to talk about with respect to this whole diesel fuel additive, multifunction diesel fuel additives. We have not scratched the surface of all of the different kinds of diesel fuel additives, because in addition to these multifunctions, you've got single functions that address individual specific problems, single function cetane improvers, single function lubricity improvers, and cold flow improvers. And we've got plenty of other training presentations that will go into those individual things in more detail. So, but for now, this should have given you a pretty good general overview of diesel fuel treatment. So if you have any questions, you can email them to me. This is my email address, ebjornstad@bellperformance.net. And just reference that you were watching the diesel fuel treatment video, and just let me know what questions you have. I will be glad to help. So anyway, that concludes our time today. Once again, I'm Eric Bjornstad, Technical Information Director with Bell Performance. Thanks very much for joining me. See you next time. Bye.